I'm Gray Krause. I'm the director of the Emeritus College, and it's certainly a great pleasure to welcome all of you here to what is one of our major programs for the entire year. There are many people to thank for today's event, but first and foremost, I want to acknowledge Jag and Madhu Sheth, who have generously underwritten this lecture series since it began in 2004. So thank you both. I want to thank our Mind Matters Committee who selected this year's speaker. And what I would like for all of you to do is imagine that you're in Governor's Hall eating a lunch that would have been supplied by the endowment for this lecture. Unfortunately, it's not possible to do that. We hope certainly by next year we'll be able to do that. And I think everybody understands that. And now what I would like to do is to introduce John Gunneman, who is Professor Emeritus of Social Ethics in the Candler School of Theology, who will introduce our distinguished speaker today.
It is a great pleasure to introduce my friend and former colleague, Robert Franklin, as our 2021 Sheth lecturer. But it's not an easy task because Robert's resume is so remarkable and so rich that if I did it justice, he'd have no time to speak today. So I need to select some highlights. Robert is the James T. and Berta R. Laney Professor of Moral Leadership at Emory, the first to hold this prestigious chair. He was appointed to this chair after having given moral leadership to many institutions, including as the 10th president of his alma mater, Morehouse College, from 2007 to 2012, and before that, from 1997 to 2002, as president of the Interdenominational Theological Seminary of the Atlanta University Center. Between those two presidencies, he was the program officer in human rights and social justice at the Ford Foundation and served as theologian in residence at the 2000 season of the Chautauqua Institution. Now, during and around these positions of institutional leadership, Robert has taught at the University of Chicago and Harvard University Divinity Schools, Colgate-Rochester Theological Seminary, Stanford University, and the Candler School of Theology, where I first came to know him in his first incarnation there. He has taught on and off several times at Candler. He is a senior fellow at Emory Center for the Study of Law and Religion, and holds honorary degrees from, my count at least, 6 colleges and universities. Robert has authored 4 books, all of them marvelous, but his most recent is Moral Leadership, Integrity, Courage, Imagination, which grew out of his current position and work on moral leadership at Emory. And finally, I must mention Rob's recent bid for public office. In a special election in November, he ran for John Lewis's House seat when it was briefly empty between the November 6th election of Nikema Williams and the January 20th inauguration when she would take office. Had Robert won, he would have served as the congressional representative for at least, I think, 2 to 3 weeks. He did not win that election, but many of us thought that with a larger turnout, and I asked how many Georgians, or for that matter, how many of you here even knew about that election. But with a larger turnout, we think he could have won and given voice to his deeply held convictions about the importance of moral leadership at the national level. And some of us hope he may run again. But now we have the chance to hear directly some of his thoughts on moral leadership. Please join me in welcoming Robert Franklin as our 2021 Sheth lecturer.
Thank you a great deal, John, and thank you all for your presence. And I too look forward to a time when we can gather and break bread and proceed with conversation and good food, as is the norm. I'd like to thank Madhu and Jay for making this opportunity possible, for bringing enlightened and curious women and men from across this extraordinary university and indeed our region to explore probing and important questions about the human good. I also want to thank Gray and Diane and all the staff for your support in helping to facilitate my safe arrival and into this space. And so I've been looking forward to this for some time. I've listened to a couple of previous Sheth lectures, and many of them are my friends, my teachers and mentors. I always learn a great deal, and I think you keep alive in this lecture series the vision of liberal learning that is at the very core of Emory University's founding, and indeed of all universities and pursuits of knowledge and the human good. Special word of appreciation to President Benvis and interim provost and my Candler Dean, Jan Love, who've been longstanding conversation partners and colleagues, and so excited about the direction of our university at this time under exceptional leadership. And John, finally, thank you for your generous and concise introduction. I have learned so much from John Gunneman over the years, and he's always been a patient and discerning listener and colleague, and so the learning continues. I think that I'd like to begin by inflicting upon you a screen share here, and you will see that my effort here is to focus our conversation. I'll talk for a bit, and then I look forward to opportunities for exchange in the moments ahead. Focusing on the theme of moral leadership in turbulent times. Some of you will recognize this theme of leadership in turbulent times as something that our dear friend and scholar Doris Kearns Goodwin raised a couple of years ago in her important book as she examined the quality of US presidential leadership at particularly significant moments of transition and crisis. But here, I think, is an effort to put a finer point on the kind of leadership that I think is needed as we seek to refine and sustain our democracy. And I refer to that as moral leadership. And here I highlight the fact that leaders of all kinds, here thinking more generally again, engage in mobilization. Leaders mobilize people, they mobilize resources to accomplish goals, a kind of simple, straightforward definition. And whether you're at the Cosweta Business School or in the social sciences departments, those two areas where leadership is talked about quite a bit, certainly in places like Candler. Interesting, I've noticed in just examining websites, some of the literature written in medicine or in law, other fields, often there's less tendency to talk about leadership per se, more of kind of leadership teams or collaboration, the ethos of a discipline and vocation. But certainly in business, in social sciences, in theology, and some certain disciplines seem to really pay attention to who leads, the quality of leadership, the formation of leadership. And often the presumption is that they will also be collaborative, they will work in teams and so on. Just a passing observation about the genre and focus of some disciplines. So I think we all agree that the effective and productive leadership, leaders that accomplish those goals, may be technically efficient, but morally misdirected. That's the claim of those who take this concept of moral leadership seriously. This whole notion of kind of technical rationality, an ability to accomplish things according to a certain mathematical precision is valued in our culture today. But I think this does raise the problem of one who, an Adolf Hitler, for instance. One can think of less dramatic examples, but that's an extreme, of people who are ruthless in execution and efficient production of certain kinds of intended outcomes, but really have visions of community and the good life that are troubling. And so ancient moral and political philosophy and certain modern philosophies invite us to aim higher, to talk about leadership as somehow tapping into human motivation that elevates people. Think of how James Davison Hunter in his important work has looked at leadership that transforms people by speaking to their motives. So moral leadership, as I think about it, focuses on people of virtue. There are many virtues, as you know. I highlight, because I think context matters for our time, the virtues of courage, integrity, imagination, I might add, empathy and wisdom are certainly also important here, who serve the common good, and that's their focus, not simply their own particular tribes, but looking at a larger sense, a more expansive, aspirational sense of community, a common good, while inviting others to join. I think that's the fundamental leadership move, is that one engages, one inspires, one invites. There are a number of ways of conceptualizing how leaders engage other people, how followers come to exist in the world. And then this notion that, and so as a kind of working definition here, because I've been in some audiences where people were somewhat uncomfortable with the language of moral leadership. So I often simply use as a kind of almost a synonym, a leadership for the common good is fundamentally what we're talking about. And so I argue that moral leadership elevates and it transforms as it mobilizes people. As we are on our journey aimed at this goal, people are being transformed. It isn't simply about the ruthless prosecution of a set of aims, goals, but also asking periodically, how are the people in this organization doing? It's an interesting set of diagnostic questions that emerge here. And I write a little about this in my little book on moral leadership. But again, the attention to both performance and the health of the organization, both foci. And typically, leaders will focus on performance because, you know, building and promoting strongest possible shareholder value is how those leaders are measured. My book has a practical goal of trying to stimulate these conversations about the nature of moral leadership. And in a sense, I mean, you've already figured it out. These are some of the most ancient of questions. It goes back to ancient Rome and Greece and Egypt and China and beyond. What is the nature of a good life, the well-lived life, a meaningful life? And secondly, and related, what's the nature of a good community, a just society? So person and community constantly the focus, whether it's Plato's dialogues or the long history of moral and political philosophy. So I make four basic claims here in terms of, again, our context, the American context, that democracy requires virtue and purposes that aim higher than the immediate satisfaction of human need. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy, how do we move to those higher levels of human want and need? And some leaders are able to go there, to take us there. And I think that those are the leaders we think of as the transformational moral leaders. I'll look forward to, in our conversation, who are the people who have moved you in this way? Who do you think? And who's worthy of celebration, even remembrance and memorial along these lines? Lincoln, I love his observation. John Meacham used this quote in his speech to the National Press gathering a couple of years ago, that there's always just enough virtue in this republic to save it, sometime none to spare, but still enough to meet the emergency. And many people feel and have felt, and since January 6th activities and tragedies just a few months ago, it's hard to believe, here we are now in April, but in January, America was really at a turning point, at a pivot point, Institutions ultimately worked and did what they were supposed to. That rebellion was quelled. But I think there's some lingering questions, and perhaps we can engage some of that today. Democracy requires virtue. Secondly, our time, our zeitgeist. Martin Luther King was fond of using this notion of the zeitgeist, those two German words, zeitgeist, time, spirit, spirit of the times. He said every morning, every leader should awaken asking, what is this zeitgeist? What is our zeitgeist? And what am I called to do? Who am I called to become? So this notion that of many scholars, journalists, others who measure these questions, from the Pew Research Center to Gallup, concern about growing public cynicism about America's moral standards. And these annual values and morals polls are continuing to worry me as I look at how people perceive that the nation is not doing very well here, that 49% of respondents rate moral values in the country as poor. This can be argued, much of this exceedingly subjective, and yet there is a general sense as we look at look at the most obvious manifestations of a seeming erosion, breakdown, fragmentation of our moral discourse and moral life, as Alistair McIntyre writes about that. Well, January 6th, or continuing bad policing, incompetent policing that triggers public uprisings and protests. All of that are part of the moral core, not simply are individuals any better or any worse at telling the truth, keeping their promises, being reciprocal in their relationships, as Francis Fukuyama and others who talk about the erosion of social capital and trust in our democracy, and the need to improve that, even for the sake of improving our business environments. Democracy requires virtue. There's concern that we are in decline now, Pew and Gallup. Moral decline can be contagious, is my third worry. Why are we talking about this today? These trends of lying, cheating, theft, hatred, racism, violence, on and on, won't simply stop and reverse themselves. I would argue, with all of the social engineering and tinkering and legislation that may get passed, I understand today, Supreme Court will hear cases about whether or not individuals should, in fact, be allowed to carry weapons in public. It's going to lead to yet another conversation about who are we as a nation? What kind of people do we want to become? But my concern is that this downward trend is going to require a certain kind of presence, a leadership, a change of ethos. Many of you would argue change of culture. And I look forward to our conversation about that. Andrew Cullison is doing some terrific work up at DePaul University Center on Ethics, as our Paul Wolpe in our Center of Ethics looks at the issue, the perception that unethical behavior is increasingly commonplace, has a snowball effect. If people think if moral standards have eroded and no one else is following the rules, why should I? That is exceedingly dangerous to the state of our lives in this city and country and the global community. And so how do we restore that sense of trust, of cooperation, of reciprocity among the citizens? And then fourth, this concern, not only that it's contagious, our decline, but also this corruption can be deadly. I may be over dramatizing, but it's the point that this ethos of mistrust, of skepticism, of do whatever you can get away with, threatens to destroy our families, our schools and universities, our congregations. And I argue that it will bore deep into people, into our individual human souls. It can threaten to empty us out, hollow us out, that part of us that can appreciate literature and philosophy, poetry and opera, and we will become rotten people. I hope that's not over dramatizing, but that is the ultimate worry here. And some of you know T.S. Eliot's wonderful poem from 1925, The Hollow Man, I would add women, that describes after the war this desolate populations of people, empty, defeated people in search of meaning. And yet we find moral leadership kind of springs forth. It emerges sometimes in unlikely, unexpected places and ways. So the phenomena of the whistleblower, I mean, think about a year ago, we were listening to congressional hearings and learning of people who were working in the previous presidential administration, who were concerned about bad behavior and began to talk about it. Many of them being outed, many of them punished. This drama is continuing. But I'm simply reminding us that Time magazine a few years ago did highlight whistleblowers, those moral agents who live their lives according to a code of ethics. They privately seek to be consistent with their deeply held values, but don't necessarily think of themselves as moral leaders in that sense. And recall, I emphasize the role of inviting others, enlisting others in the journey. These are folks who are just minding their own business, but living according to reading their moral compass. They're doing their work, and on occasion, they are compelled to speak up, to call attention to injustice and immorality. And that's what, in this instance, the three women featured here did. And so good for Time magazine for recognizing them as the kind of persons of the year. And yet many, and I've interviewed people who think I may have done a good deed on that day, but otherwise don't bother me. Don't call me. I'm not the moral leader. I want to get back to my life. But I will do what I have to do when I perceive the context calls for it. I think that's tremendous. That's an indication that, a good university education is working when people have that sense. On the other hand, and this is something I try to highlight in the book, some moral agents are called to be moral leaders. That is to say, whether they're in engineering and sciences and law, medicine, business, theology, and ministry, whatever their calling is, educators and artists, they also feel if, someone needs to sort of stay at the knitting here in terms of trying to inspire and transform people's lives and motivations. And although I don't necessarily nominate myself as an exemplar, I'm willing to stay at it. In in chapter 1 of the book, I just highlight these 3 quotes. I sometimes ask students on the first day of class to write a 1-page, pick one of the quotes and reflect on this notion of moral leadership as you think about it. Of course, Shakespeare's notion that some are born great, some achieve, some have greatness thrust upon them. That was the sense of the whistleblowers. These are people not looking for a big fight, and yet somehow they end up on international television testifying before a Senate Judiciary Committee because the President of the United States seemed to be engaged in a quid pro quo, and I couldn't stand it. My oath of office required me to speak, thrust upon them. Or James Baldwin's fascinating observation: people are trapped in history and history trapped in them. Every teacher on this line knows something about how we engage students who bring certain histories and whom confront us, may confront and surprise our own ethical sensibilities, and what we do with that. Where does the conversation go after that? I'll just mention as a footnote, 2 weeks ago in my class, I'm teaching a class on social movements, the civil rights movement we were talking about. And one student who hadn't said much in class all week said, I just learned that my uncle attended the January 6th rally, and we just learned about it. And it has sent shockwaves throughout our family. And I mean, she hadn't spoken at all in class. Suddenly the whole class is pivoted. What does a young, college student say to the family about this kind of matter? So it was a fascinating discussion, and it just reminded me, people trapped in history, history trapped in them. How do we get free? How have you helped students become free of those pasts? And then the sobering challenge from Ella Baker. Many of you know that name. If not, you should know it because she has been such a profound influencer of everyone from Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, the California farm worker activist, to President Barack Obama, who acknowledged her as the most powerful community organizer during the 60s and 70s, who helped transform lives and helped to organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We could look at Aristotle and his insight in his books on ethics, that three things required at least: moral knowledge, knowledge of what's good and right and praiseworthy, the will or desire to do good. Perhaps we have to incentivize that at times. It's interesting, as we talk about the vaccine, COVID vaccines, many people will be early adopters, perhaps most all of you in this class today, audience today, but others, even in NPR this morning, we may have to incentivize, we have to pay some people to take very interesting, the desire. How do you cultivate the will to say, okay, I'll roll up my sleeve? And then others arguing, no, some things need to be mandated. So you see these interesting debates about the nature of a good community where reciprocity, social cooperation, and trust are required to go forward. We can come to that during the discussion. But Aristotle says, in addition to knowledge of the right and good, a desire to do it is also the practice. The practice, and practice, of course, implies failure and occasional success. And over time, he says, these three combine: the knowledge, the desire, or will, as he often writes about it, and the practice of speaking the truth, keeping your promises, being reciprocal, forgiving those who harm you, that together these produce certain habits. Robert Bellah, the great sociologist, along with the Emory University's own Stephen Tipton, wrote about habits of the heart, this notion of the habit of stepping forth in a challenging situation to exercise courage. And so moral agents come to be acknowledged as moral leaders when they consistently are called to practice their vocation and invite others to join the movement for justice and goodness. I write a little about these virtues of integrity, courage, imagination, and give these, I hope, pithy characterizations of integrity as a centering down art, a connecting to your deepest values, and the need for contemplation, for quiet, reflection, prayer, conversation, even the arts, to open our imagination, to help us discern what is right and good. This is the book, came out last year, and some mention of Emory University and many colleagues in the book, but it's a way of starting a conversation. I offer a class on principles and practices of moral leadership. But let me just turn now to something I do in the book for just a few pages, but I find increasingly provocative, even almost breaking news. Perhaps you heard this weekend, new appointment of a chair of the Stone Mountain Memorial Association. And what happens there? I want to invite you into that conversation. But let's just think about this notion of public monuments. This is on the minds of a lot of people these days. Emory University is engaged. There are over 60, 70 universities, many of them in the South, that got started with UVA, University of Virginia, grappling with its history and the Robert E. Lee legacy and all of, but then other universities joined in, and we have some distinguished scholars and leaders, thought leaders, helping this university try to puzzle our way through this. And I really admire what Claire Stirk and Greg Benvis have done with Dean Love, Jan Love, in helping us reflect on memorials, street names, building names. So, but I love this observation by David Roos, a powerful journalist, who says public monuments don't emerge out of thin air. They're products of collective human effort, and often expensive, time consuming to honor, a group of people, historical, but what's key here, at some level, all public monuments are statements of power. And he goes on to talk about what we see. Many of you have visited the extraordinary monuments of ancient Egypt. The pharaohs erected these pyramids, on and on. We look at more contemporary, the Lenin, Stalin, these sort of colossal monuments that are always kind of curious to me. And you can argue that public monuments dedicated to women, civil rights leaders, and victims and martyrs to valiant causes are also statements of power. Isn't that an interesting notion? How power may be manifest and remembered. By acknowledging the achievements, sacrifices of historically less powerful groups, these monuments are ways of taking power from the oppressors and literally carving their rightful place in history. So just a fascinating notion. I have thoughts here and in the book about the period of sort of so-called colossalism in American architecture. Just a couple of vignettes some of you will appreciate. You know, America, we didn't really have significant monuments coming out of the revolution into the 19th century. You know, this is a young nation just building, figuring itself out. Well, there were some who felt we needed these colossal monuments, and toward the end of the 19th century, we received this wonderful gift, all of 150 feet tall, in the Statue of Liberty. Well, that's extraordinary. But of course, the Eiffel Tower, built to commemorate the centennial of the French Revolution, early intellectuals and artists in Paris were livid about the prospect of this large, ungainly sort of monument being built in the middle of Paris. It was a Walter Benjamin's notion. You know, Paris does not need you. It doesn't need people. It's beautiful unto itself, per se. And so to build this thing, so the writers really petitioned, said, this tower is a problem. A monstrous Eiffel Tower, you see some of the language, and why, you know, in the presence of why put this barbaric bulk next to Notre Dame, and the tour, on and on. And then in my favorite little anecdote here, the artist and writer Guy de Maupassant supposedly ate lunch in the tower's restaurant every day because it was the only place in Paris where the tower was not visible. I had to chuckle at that. Well, think about that model. Artists and intellectuals in Paris, the Eiffel Tower, what is it commemorating? And now our conversation, because the eyes of the nation are on Georgia. Yes, problematic voting laws, but now also, and I think this is going to get more attention as we go forward, so we need to have better answers. What to do with Stone Mountain? I've heard John Gunneman weigh in on this in a powerful way in the past. He may speak up today on this, but it is chilling to think that as that project was getting underway, the carving actually began in 1923, and Gutzon Borglum, the brilliant architect and sculptor who began work on this project in 1923, quirky personality, didn't get along with Helen Plain and the United Daughters of the Confederacy and others. So they sort of had a falling out, and he moved on. Where did he go next? Well, we'll come to that in a minute. But this brilliant sculptor did notice or observe that the Confederacy furnished the story for this monument, this artistic representation. God furnished the mountain, how convenient of God. And if I can furnish the craftsmanship and you will furnish the financial support, then we will put there something before which the world will stand amazed. Isn't that interesting? This is his fundraising pitch in 1915. This, of course, is also the year of the release of the film Birth of a Nation. And following the release of that film on Thanksgiving Day, 1915, is when all of you have certainly heard about it, but that's when it occurred. After viewing the film, and on Thanksgiving evening, they went up to the top of Stone Mountain, and the Ku Klux Klan experienced what it thought of as a rebirth that evening by burning a cross there. in the paper a couple of days later. This was the piece, kind of Atlanta Constitution. Very impressed with how this demonstration, public demonstration, was executed there. Well, our brilliant, and he was brilliant. I mean, his method of thinking about colossal structures and inventing the various and sundry architectural and engineering methods and practices to accomplish carving into granite these figures emerged. And so he was also a committed white supremacist and a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So Borglum is exceedingly problematic. Nonetheless, Mount Rushmore, his next project, he leaves Stone Mountain after only 2 years of work, has a falling out. They actually destroy the only thing he'd accomplished in that year and a half of drilling was the head of Robert E. Lee. They blew that away and then started over. They talk about erasing the board. It was extraordinary. In any case, there in South Dakota, many of you have been, others who haven't, please make it a point to see it at some point. But there in these mountains of the Lakota, called them the Six Grandfathers, there were numerous candidates considered for creating this Western monument. What was the point of the monument? To get Americans who were beginning road trips, that fine American practice of having an automobile, loading up the car, and driving across the country. Well, that happens in the early 1900s. And the question was, is there a way in which we can incentivize people not to stop in Chicago, but to keep driving and come out to South Dakota? So that was the point. This was really an effort aimed at tourism. And the early scholars or early commissioners thought it would be important to have someone who would embody the West, spirit of the West. So Lewis and Clark, you see in the picture there, pictured with Sacagawea. There's Buffalo Bill. There is Chief Red Cloud. The idea is that for the first 150 years, we should perhaps identify people who represent the West. And so it was kind of interesting because Susan B. Anthony was also a possibility. And of course, a young Sacagawea, a Lakota woman who was the guide for Lewis and Clark. It's kind of interesting that you think about Mount Rushmore, we ended up with 4 presidents, but there could have been, people of color and women on that mountain. Well, the local historical commission of South Dakota got overruled. The Gutzon Borglum wanted the presidents to represent the birth of the nation, the development and growth of the nation, the development of the nation, and then the preservation of the nation, those 4. Crazy Horse was another Indian, Native American, Lakota personality that was considered. What's fascinating here is that the Lakota really objected to what happened at Mount Rushmore. They suggested Crazy Horse as the only of the Native American who might be a proper candidate to stand alongside Washington and Jefferson, initially the 2 presidents who would be carved. And so anyhow, he never responded. There's some other observations about Mount Rushmore, and part of the exercise I often invite students into is to name 2 or 3 people whom you would suggest if we were to have a kind of Mount Rushmore of moral leaders. And one can imagine and play with this notion. There's Ella Baker on the left, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, the only of these 4, by the way, who is still alive. She's in her 90s there in California. And then, of course, young Martin King. I noted that breaking news, because this weekend, the governor of the state appointed a new chair. And Chairman Abraham Mosley, who is a pastor from Athens for the past 40, almost 50 years. It's interesting, it's the first time an African-American has been appointed chair of the, yes, Stone Mountain Memorial Association. So this is a fascinating moment. as we think about how other cities responded to these statutes, and the question of what's a state to do when the monument in question is carved 42 feet deep and 400 feet above ground, on and on. Well, a question of what do moral leaders think and do that elevates others and changes history. And these are just some features that I highlight in the book in terms of helping us, they themselves commit themselves to becoming lifelong learners of the nature of love, power, justice, empathy. They become lifelong moral teachers. They frame issues in compelling ways. Think of Martin King in Montgomery. Yeah, let's boycott 1955, but it's more than that. This is a drama of good versus evil. Public intellectuals, moral leaders do this in a particularly compelling way. And these other features, and I love Samuel Beckett's quote there: ever tried, ever fail, no matter, try again, fail better. And I think Cornel West introduced me to this quote, but it captures that sense of number 3, that we all strive to live exemplary lives. We don't always get it right every day, but we must not be daunted or by failure. We should continue. Get up, brush yourself off, try again, fail better. So I find that always inspiring. I had a section here. We don't have time to go into this, but I would simply highlight, because we're all thinking about what do we learn from the pandemic 100 years ago, and then the war and today's global tourism. The movement of large numbers of people was the issue. A president in denial at the time. I think most would argue that for a while our previous president was also in a state of denial about this. So another interesting parallel, the way that weather impacts things, the way in which quarantining is designed, and the bargaining that can occur as well. Anyhow, just the things that I'm asking students to reflect on, what we learned from what happened then. The big difference now, of course, the presence of vaccines at a time when epidemiology and virology and science and the development was really in its nascent stage. And these were just some observations about the emergence in various states of waves of emergence, reemergence, and excess mortality. The big point here and the warning here is that after things seemed to tamp down during 1919, so 1918, there are 3 waves, in a sense, something we've experienced in 2020, then a good long run, but then that a year and a half almost later, and we get this extraordinary reemergence. So it's a kind of warning, I think, to all of us in terms of what the future may hold. What do leaders do during times of crisis? Acting with urgency, communicating with transparency. They respond productively to missteps and speak honestly about them. They engage in constant updating, and they tap into suffering to build meaning, which is an interesting process. I think even as we puzzle through, as the Emory University reopens the re-entry of massive numbers of people, I think some ritual, some practices, people talking about what they've experienced, how they survive, how they cope, what they learned. Everyone has a story or a poem or some way of identifying a kind of moment of transformation and endurance, and we should create space for people to share those. And I urge fellow colleagues and faculty to offer that space, and I think that's part of best practice. I also want to, these are just some more reflections, but this notion that suffering can be a shortcut to mindfulness is an interesting notion for trying to find common ground, find empathy and build empathy among groups that may feel in tension, may be experiencing polarization. And I think this is a challenge, certainly for national leadership. I hope the current president, Biden and Harris, will understand and utilize this. My sense, as he's typically referred to as a consoler in chief, is that he is leveraging his own past experiences of suffering and loss in a particularly compelling way. And I hope that will continue. We'll all learn something about the power of empathy and past suffering to build deep bonds with people with whom we currently are in political tension and division. So that is my formal presentation. I'll simply conclude with the observation by Maimonides, the great medieval rabbi and scholar, that the world is equally balanced between good and evil, and your next act will tip the scale. Thank you for listening. And I'll remind you that I've asked for your nominations for what if Governor Kemp calls you today and appoints you a member of a commission to help puzzle out the future of Stone Mountain. And the decision is, well, we do need new and different images there. Whom you might nominate. I just think this is a real-time case. And certainly had I been elected, John, this is the kind of thing I would have wanted to raise in the halls of Congress, that let's rethink what we're doing with monuments. And I will call upon the Sheth lecture audience as consultants to help move that process forward. So this is hypothetical, but something could come of this. I see Don Salyer's hand.
Robert, thank you. You always stimulate a range of things simultaneously, so that's a great gift you have. I want to have you say just a few more words about common suffering, because the paradox, I think, in part of our time, and especially those of us who lived through the 20th century, the enormous, vast suffering that we cannot escape and yet do. And so I think there is a secret hidden there in how to find discourse that allows us to cross over big differences, because as human beings, we have lost, or we have enormous regret, or there is this gap between the world as we think it should be and the world that we've experienced. I know you have some examples in mind of where appeal to common suffering across great difference has made a difference in the discourse. That's a big concern, I think, of any of us, and particularly one of mine. I've been particularly interested in how music that touches on the depths of suffering becomes a common discourse. Thinking, of course, of the spirituals, but I'm going to go on too long here. I want to put it back in your court. Say some more about that business of how common suffering can be a gathering point that gets us beyond our ideological brickbats. It's enough for me.
Thank you, Don. I'm so grateful for your question, your contextualization of the question, but also your own Sheth lecture and the insights you shared then. The power of art. I think you've anticipated one important element of a response, how we move from the personal to a more collective community building and inclusive sense of how we move through this common human experience together and creating a sense of respect, of empathy, and perhaps, not guaranteed, of solidarity in going forward. I mean, it's part of what Dr. King was aiming for, and reached a certain level of achievement, but wanted to go further. So yes, art is a way to do that. There are common words, there are common song texts that help us. And I would say, having watched the Oscar Awards last night, that there's also the power of film and graphic art to do this. Now, this kind of takes us back again to the art that divides when we think about Stone Mountain, but the art that unites. And the two pieces that I've reflected on, and part of my learning after the 2016 election was, what do I need to know about my neighbors who reside in rural small town Georgia and America, that as an urban, an African-American, educated, on and on, that I may be missing. And so that was a part of the challenge. Dean Jan Love challenged us to, let's find out who we need to listen to, because we may be in a bubble. And the interesting thing was, I went to this memoir, Hillbilly Elegies. Some of you know J.D. Vance's work, and the very compelling documentary or film piece that emerged from that. Glenn Close was nominated for Best Actress, I think. In any case, it was an amazing story of human suffering that I found I was able to connect to. And so it makes your point, Professor Salyers, that compelling classic art emerges out of a particular culture, but it speaks to the universal. That's the nature of the classic, isn't it? So many of you have talked about this. I see my friend Vernon Robbins here. He's talked about the power of period pieces, of texts that emerge out of particular cultures, but speak to everyone. It's Jane Joyce's writing about Dublin. He said, if I can get Dublin right, describe it, I will have the core and heart of every city in the world. For, as he puts it, for in the particular lies the human universal. Wow. So it's this extraordinary notion of paying attention to local culture, local knowledge, local texts. And so I'll stop there.
Okay, and Vernon Robbins has his hand up.
Yes, thank you so much. This presentation and beyond this, for your long years of moral leadership and moral leadership that you will continue. I would like to hear you talk about the special challenges of moral leadership in a context of a nation that has such a high level of individualism. As you know, the United States is one of 7 major nations or so that are unusual in the world for its individualism, rather than its natural understanding of a personal self as a member of a community. It makes it especially hard then to develop a concept of the common good. Could you help us a bit with this, please?
Thanks, Vernon. It's a compelling and challenging question for our time. We've heard a lot of reports, Robert Putnam, others, talking about declined social capital and connectedness. So I hear your question in that context. So much rings true, pardon me, there. But we also, attentive to those spaces where connections, deep connections are happening. Yes, maybe the decline in bowling leagues, but things are happening in congregations. Things are happening in alternative social spaces where people find a sense of connection through sports and athletic associations. So I think, wherever it's happening, we ought to celebrate it and try to certainly encourage. But I don't have the simple response or answer to this perplexing issue, because I think ultimately everyone is translating these wonderful policy proposals and moral rhetoric about our togetherness and American identity and so on into what's in it for me, and what will it cost me. And so I think that this is a real continuing challenge. Back to Aristotle's wisdom, though, this notion of the knowledge of what is good, what would be best for America to be a unified, strong nation as we engage other nations. and the will and desire to work with our, with fellow neighbors. I think that we need to have to incentivize that work more. I would love to see our foundations, the independent sector, do more here. I think the academy can do more to help offer some visions of what's possible. In the final chapter of the book, I pick up on a wonderful quote by Alexis de Tocqueville, who observes rather, the greatness of America lies not in her being more enlightened than other nations, but rather in her ability to repair her faults. Her ability to repair her faults. And I would pose the question to you all, do you think, does that still exist? Is that ability to repair our faults still present in American consciousness and DNA or not? Has it, or you might ask him, de Tocqueville wrote that in 1840s, right? 20 years before the Civil War. So we could ask, was it true even then? I wish Brooks Holyfield was here, but there are other historians who can speak to that kind of question. I'm sorry, Vernon, I don't have a good answer. I do see, though, possibilities for incentivizing and building on what's going on now. And maybe we have some answers at Emory.
Maybe just one short comment would be allowed. I wonder if we're in a time when kind of cells develop, and they can develop very quickly through virtual communities that function kind of as real communities. And I wonder if moral leadership in a context of individualism may be helped by specific discussion of the way in which those small cellular groups function, even within a particular church. It would be a small group that may form.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
suggestive. And learning how to appeal to them.
Yes.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you for that. Yes.
Okay, and Rosemary McGee has her hand up.
Greetings. Thank you so much. Okay, is it a little bit better now?
That's better for me, yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My question at this time in our life, very engaged in life and work and thinking and reflecting, as you've called upon us to do today. What is our role in these kinds of areas of...
Yeah, so Rosemary, what I'll say is that Rosemary is in a very remote location. So she had warned me that her question might come through, and in case it didn't, she says, my question is what we're called, especially to do at this time in our lives, as people who are mostly retired, but still very engaged in life and even work.
Yes, yes. Well, I think, Vernon offers some suggestive thoughts about how local cells, smaller groups of people, of affiliations and connections might become more audacious as we go forward, might build upon even the common experience of suffering. I think, I wonder if there's a crisis here that we shouldn't allow to get away, to escape us. That is how COVID has leveled and impacted our lives, and yet people are interpreting it and reacting in a variety of ways. But I think naming the common human plight of facing, this sort of unseen killer in the human experience, and how we can go forward, asking why people have such different responses, and trying to exhibit a kind of respect and open-mindedness about that. Ultimately, I think that it is the respect that goes a long way. After George Floyd's murder, Washington Post reports that over 60% of white Americans reported an appreciation for, respect for, a newfound understanding of what the kind of movement for Black lives represented. Now that as a general movement, not to be confused with there's a specific organization, Black Lives Matter, said, so I'm not referring to that, but this larger kind of social movement for Black lives that, people all over the country were felt, yes, there's something fundamentally important about policing in our democracy that respects all people, that does not use violence against unarmed people, on and on. We need leaders who can help seize upon these common perceptions of value and good, build and expand our social units that organize around these, and prepare us for the next assault, that is the next trauma of, for instance, political elections and campaigns that occur that have a way of dividing us once again. I don't think we do a very good job of sort of anticipating what the next big election will do given our polarized nation. Thank you again, Rosemary. I mean, you raise a provocative question. It's a difficult question, but I'd like to think more about and think with you all about how we might respond in more compelling ways. And I've tried to offer in this little book some suggestions about bridging divides through respect, through identification of common interest and common aspiration.
And so in that context, I'll just say there was one question submitted in advance of your talk. And that question was, please talk about the morality of Black Lives Matter. And can this be the great awakening that America needs? Consider the context of the white supremacist movement.
Yeah, I think that is certainly going to be a clash that has to work itself out and get negotiated. While I think it is important to highlight this race analysis and race narrative, I think it will also polarize many, will frighten many, will not invite many to this party. And so I'm always interested in what is the move that invites and engages. And that's where I'd rather, but in addition to talking about the phenomena of race in our contemporary society, what is, your organization's race narrative, I really want to talk more and follow the logic of Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about intersectionality. We ought to talk about our intersectional identities, multiple identities that represent both challenges and promise. So it's race and gender and class and sexual orientation and religious identity or non-religious and so on. To think in more really complicated ways and not trying to simply isolate. So I've been challenging some members of the Movement for Black Lives to really kind of broaden the discourse. I'm reading a book now. I commend to you Alicia Garza, Garza, is one of the three young women who founded Black Lives Matter after the Ferguson, Missouri tragedy, Michael Brown. And I found her to be really quite insightful and helpful to me for thinking about possibilities for coalition building and expansion. She's critical of some contemporary leaders, Black and white, who seem to who profit from polarization, who, it's like candidates, Republican and Democrat, who are raising money now on the results of the George Floyd Chauvin. So it's that kind of manipulation, I think, that's really threatening. And so I love the message of valuing Black lives. I think it needs a more complicated and a more sensitive leadership going forward and I think we have it in a person like Alicia Garza, as she writes about growing up in Marin County, of all places, a Black family and a wealthy white community, as one of the founders of this movement. I think she brings some powerful insights into how to build connections.
And Liza Davis has her hand up.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, thought-provoking. Thank you for running for office. I voted for you and I was very disappointed that you didn't win. But my question is about whether your students and whether you in your classes talk about moral leadership addressing environmental challenges, because I know a number of theologians and philosophers contemporary have really plugged into that, particularly, you know, with regard to some of texts. I'm curious about what your students might have to say, whom they might name
Hmm.
as moral leaders in terms of environmental change.
Oh, wonderful question. And thanks for your patience, Lisa. And I'll be brief because I see a few hands up and I don't want to prolong this by giving long responses. So short answer, Greta Thunberg, the young, I guess she's still a teenager, was I think from Sweden, but in any case, a global personality who's emerged to raise these issues. Within the theological community, a number of theologians at Emory, as well as Wake Forest, are leading the charge on this movement called theoecology. A number of other people name it in different ways around the country. But we do have a movement and focused on environmentalism, on we had a terrific dissertation written by an Emory student this year. In fact, Professor Ted Smith and I co-supervised Joy Orr, her dissertation on farming and urban farming as a window into for urban congregations and people to sort of think more about relation to land and nature. And just creative work underway, and of course, Earth Day this past weekend. So we have a lot to build on there. I'm encouraged because that tends to be, and you're right on, Lisa, the common ground issues like the environment are ones that are pulling people together across the political divide. So I'm encouraged. Thank you.
And Gretchen has her hand up.
Well, like everyone else, I want to start by saying thank you so much for agreeing to do the Sheth and giving us such a wonderful presentation. And by the way, it sounds to me, I help schedule speakers for us the rest of the year and for the Sheth as well. And it sounds to me like maybe we should get in touch with Joy, the woman you just mentioned, and have her come talk to us about her work. But for my question, I wanted to go back to what you were saying towards the end of your presentation, what Don Sailors followed up on, that maybe the way to get past what is so terrible, the ideological divisions in this country and worldwide, the possibility of getting past that by means of empathy, by tapping into common suffering, by means of feeling. You know, we can think the good thoughts about being good, but without the heart. And so I'm going to tie my question to work you will know well, namely Laney's book, Education of the Heart, and what you would say about whether we're doing better in colleges and universities and generally in educating the heart, and what we might still need to do along those lines to make this greater empathy possible.
Yeah, thank you, Gretchen. I think you're right on. I hope you will invite Joy, or she'd be happy to do that, and she is here in the city. I think that, you know, again, this phenomena of suffering as a shortcut, a window into mindfulness, is an interesting notion that we ought to sit with and ask, how are we going to, you know, leverage sounds like a manipulative political term, so I don't mean it in that way, but how do we kind of draw from the well of experience that we have been gifted with? And I think here is the storytelling that needs to be happening now. We're getting some of it in film. We haven't quite, you know, had significant sort of COVID-inspired stories that I'm aware of yet. but I know that they're in the pipeline. I've actually heard artists talk about things they're working on. Of course, there have been some wonderful poems and wonderful insights about what quarantining did to all of us. We stayed home. We were quiet. We read books, and in the process, nature began to heal itself. It was quieter. Birds returned. I'm forgetting the name now of the poet. She wrote this wonderful piece that I've used in class a couple of times because it invited this mindfulness, a reflection on what's happening to us that we're not even fully aware of. So I think you're right. I think that their energy and hope is in this younger generation. I listen to Emory undergrads and young people at the Atlanta University Center and Georgia Tech, and they really are concerned about the Commonwealth, about the Earth, and some scholars, some of the professors are concerned. They're not as narrowly bent on traditional measures of success as those teachers were formed in. And so it's interesting to hear the anxiety. I don't have as many students anxious to get to Wall Street, but more of them talking about social enterprise and about healing our land. So it's an interesting time, and we'll see how this evolves. Gretchen, thanks.
While most of us were coming through school, I think there was such deep suspicion about trying to bring the affective into the classroom. Yes. I mean, certainly into med schools and business schools and so on. And I do think that has begun to change big time. But let me allow time for others to ask their questions.
Okay, Rodney Hunter has his hand up.
Hey, Robert. Thanks for a wonderfully provocative and insightful presentation. It was so meaningful. I have a question about how we understand strong leadership in relationship to moral leadership. It seems to me there's a great deal of confusion in our culture about what it means to be a strong leader. We are in a democratic culture, so we want not to be authoritarians. Yes. And yet it does seem to me to be a strong moral leader, one must have a real sense of authority. There must be an ability to win others over to your sense of authority so that you can say no as well as yes, and you can chart the course ahead even when everybody doesn't agree. So there's a problem here that there's a sort of an aspect, a tendency toward authoritarianism that is involved in any exercise of authority in a democratic culture, and how we do that. I mean, your understanding is one I really like, of a kind of consultative way of working collaboratively in leadership. But there's this other aspect of leadership that has to do with strength. And I wonder how you think of strength in leadership in relationship to authoritarianism and moral.
Yeah. Oh, no, brilliant question. Thank you again. And Rod, you're another of those colleagues over the decades now from whom I've learned so much and always enriched by your writings and teaching and work. I would say that, again, just picking up on this Aristotelian method of searching for a golden mean, that there are extremes of the strong leader, you named it already, in terms of the authoritarian personalities that are out there. And I think that, many people worried that we had in the White House for that brief period, someone who seemed to be stirring, speaking to the hunger of many who believe that authoritarian type strength is what's required. And of course, that strength, we saw the underside of it, the abusiveness, the disrespect, and occasional immorality of it all. And this interesting model of having a US president who closer in value and personality to the dictators of the world and the authoritarians of Russia, North Korea, and other places. But I think that is an extreme. And then I think it's finding that strength, the focus with humility that I think puts us closer to the center. And because I think an indecisive sort of, purely collaborative, let the group decide, may not always be prudent in times of, well, the focus of our title today, right? Turbulent times.
Yes.
It may call for decisive leadership. Jump in. The roof is leaking. We kind of have to do something now. And so people like Nelson Mandela, for me, represent and embody those virtues in the golden mean of the humility, the strength, the collaboration, but a kind of clear vision and a sense of, I'm going to talk to you about what I'm doing, but I'm determined to march forward. Please join me. We can do this together. I think that's what I find inspiring. I think that it exists in a lot of places. I hear parts of that. We certainly had it in Senator John McCain. It's a loss that the U.S. Senate doesn't appear to have that kind of strong voice in a Republican community. Maybe our Governor Jeff Duncan often talks in ways that suggest to me a kind of strength and thoughtfulness and self-criticism of his own party. Stacey Abrams on the other side of the aisle, I think embodies much of that. So I think that's going to be a challenge going forward, decisive, strong leadership. But it was Ella Baker's concern, even about Martin Luther King, that these people can get off base. They can hurt a lot of people through this manipulative use of charisma. So I take the cautions in your question.
Thanks.
And Jane Sorrell has her hand up.
Thank you again. I'm thinking, and made me think about leading with empathy. How does one create empathy? How do you build empathy? And what I've noticed in the last few weeks, especially with the Chauvin case, what made the difference with that trial was that all those films of that encounter, which created in so many people this sense of empathy. What we saw was appalled. We saw the common humanity of a human being being treated in this dreadful way. And more of that perhaps is what's necessary to point out what's happening and build empathy, and perhaps then leadership through empathy. Just an observation.
It's a great observation and a great suggestion about how we, especially in a learning community, utilize these arts resources as well as actual video, because in our time, our world of social media and TikTok, a lot of this current post-millennial generation, they won't believe it unless they see authentic videos. So you're right on, Jay. Thank you.
And Kerry Bynum has his hand up.
Yes. I'm unmuted here. I don't know what.
Yeah, I can hear you, Kerry.
Oh, thank you for a very, very important lecture, sir. That was very thought-provoking. And my question has related in some ways to what both Vernon and Gretchen have posed. And that is basically looking at the idea of the art that unites. We're looking at a difference between, in some ways, broad ideas of group thinking and basically development as individuals within the curriculum. And by the way, thank you for that Beckett quote.
Yes.
But thinking in terms of those two opposing factors, one, the group think and individual development of people, it seems like the discipline that most addresses individuality and how people come to questions and how they unite in terms of certain movements, that the arts as a curricula are very important in development of individual thinking and coming to problems. And we see the arts in one case heard yesterday that one university is thinking about getting rid of the classics.
Hmm.
And I believe that that idea of art that unites really reflects this. And I wanted to see if you had a comment on that. I love this lecture. Thank you.
Carrie, that just your articulation of that is poetry to my ears. And that's this notion of art that unites, I think, is really kind of a charge to all of us. Maybe that's part of the assignment for our faculty, staff, and students who will return in the fall. Bring an example, one example of a piece of art that unites, that helped you move forward during this difficult time. So I just thank you. I mean, and others who have made this point. You see, I've entered into the chat the poem by Kitty O'Meara. I couldn't think of her name immediately, and someone could provide a link to it. But you can Google that, and it's such a lovely, compelling, thoughtful way. It helped me think about how this pandemic has impacted nature in many positive ways, and just something to consider. But yes.
Thank you.
Okay, and Uma has apparently had her real hand up, and I can't see real hands from what I'm doing. So,
first, I'm so delighted that you
whoops,
brought up this topic, which is like in these turbulent times to even raise this point of morality and moral education. I think, the person that comes to my mind as an ideal example of such moral leadership is Mahatma Gandhi. And when I was studying at Emory in 90s under Dr. James Fowler, was the then Ethics Center director, I think. And he had written a book, Stages of Faith. In that, the highest stage, 6, he puts Mahatma Gandhi in it as an exemplar. And he exactly exemplified each virtue, I will call virtue, of truth, of endurance, of fighting for justice, and all the qualities that Martin Luther King also derived inspiration from. Now, having said that, I'm thinking, is it only one-way affair that such values are exemplified by leaders which generate audience or people who follow them? Or is there any other way to induce this sense of morality, of decency, of caring, of empathy? And yesterday I heard a lecture, I'm making it short, that brought up a beautiful point. Start it early, earliest with primary school education from kindergarten. Bring up these values of how to share, how to tolerate differences, how to disagree without being disagreeable. See, these are the things that must start early at the roots. And if all schools follow some kind of course earliest since childhood and carry on through college, I think we can have some kind of moral training, moral education. Thank you.
Thank you, Uma. That's music to my ears. I'll just say in 10 seconds that is, what the ancient Greeks talked about as paideia. You named it as moral education, instilling a desire to become good. What do you want to be when you grow up? Oh, lawyer, teacher, engineer, musician. You want to be a good person. How about that? And they can actually be drawn to that, to be the promise keepers. So yeah.
We don't want to just great nation. We want
Yes.
to be a good nation.
Indeed, I love that. Yeah, yeah. And as you say, I mean, Martin King was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. So I think Gandhi's had an extraordinary 20th century impact on so many nations and the state of global consciousness about public morality, what we can achieve, and then provided the practical social methods of civil disobedience, of protest, of non-cooperation, direct action, but always in the spirit of nonviolence and respect for life. And I think King helped to carry that forward. That's our challenge today.